Howdy folks, welcome back to my YouTube channel. I am your host, the Mighty Bjorn, and today for you, I have a brand new Community Steel video. Hopefully you all have been having a pretty good time, but let's dive on into today's video, and we're going to be kicking off today's episode with the ST 1931 AT from T-Rex 2040. This weighs in at 46.09 tons. It's armed with a 90mm main gun with 119mm of penetration. And it's for the interwar period, and I do have to say that the armor on this thing is actually really good. Even though it's open topped, it was bouncing shots like a champ. However, that being said, the mobility on this thing is actually rather trash. I want to say the gun, the turret traverse it's pretty mediocre. It works. The gun elevation depression works as well, so it's not all bad on that end. Of course, I'm just getting shots planked off my hull left and right here, and I'm not really able to return fire. I'm just kind of guessing because I can't see through the damn trees, even though the AI can. As you can see there, I'm actually impacting some shots, but they are bouncing off. But I actually eat a lot of shots here. I was actually quite impressed when I saw that this was a tank destroyer. I was thinking along the lines of something lightweight. You know, kind of like your atypical tank destroyers, light armor, open topped, powerful gun, mobility, and yeah, pretty much nothing in the way of armor protection. And I actually pretty much got the complete opposite. I do want to say that this vehicle is actually really good on that end, or a really interesting take on a tank destroyer on that end, as essentially you have a vehicle that's just pretty much, honestly, it's a heavy tank with a tank destroyer turret. Is the best way to put it. But anyway, let's move on to the next one. The next one I have here is the HGS 106 12-1 from Herr Gunther. This weighs in at 62.68 tons. It's armed with a 130mm main gun with 255mm of penetration, and this is for the late war period. And honestly, when I looked at it, it kind of reminded me of like a take on doing an ISU on like an IS-3 chassis, or at least one of the other IS tanks. Maybe it's the IS-6. I couldn't really quite place my finger on what chassis it was, but it's definitely like an ISU type vehicle that's not built on an IS-2 chassis. But the armor's okay. It's fairly decent. It's nothing super incredible. There is definitely some weak spots in it. The gun is fairly good. The only thing with the gun is the reload time is definitely quite long, but that's neither here nor there. That's kind of like within the limitations of Sprocket itself. When it came to the gun accuracy, it does pretty well on that end as well. And generally overall, I like the look of the vehicle. It's got the log. It's got the spare fuel tanks. The engine deck looks really good. The front of the vehicle, the armor shaping, if you will, the vehicle looks rather good. But yeah, it's just the reload definitely caught up to me here, and I ended up losing the mission. But anyway, not actually a bad vehicle from Herr Gunther. I rather like it. Okay, next vehicle I have here is the VK1201 from Chino Dahu. And this weighs in at 13.18 tons. It's armed with a 47mm main gun with 60mm of penetration, and this is for the interwar period. Now, he mentioned that this was a heavy tank. I definitely, with its weight, its armor protection, and etc., and its firepower, I definitely would not consider this in the realm of a heavy tank. I would actually consider this as a possible competitor, if you will, to the Panzer III. Yes, it's slower than the Panzer III, but it's about the same size as the Panzer III. It's got about the same armament as the Panzer III, and even though it's slower, it still has rather decent mobility. The armor is actually rather effective. As you can see, it's very heavily sloped and even sloped on the sides. And while I said as the mobility is lower than that of a Panzer III, it's still rather good mobility. It did a good job climbing up hills and everything else. All in all, I think this is a really good tank design, and yeah, it just seems to me that it's more along the lines of a medium tank than a heavy tank. Alright, so the next vehicle I have here is the IC-16 Matilda AT from Substep. This weighs in at 33.33 tons. It's armed with a 94mm main gun. It's got 163 millimeters of penetration, and it's for the early war period. Now, I do want to admit up front that when I actually started checking this vehicle out, I assumed that it actually had a turret, and no, that is not the case. The turret is actually completely fixed, so it's more like a casemate tank, if you will. Either ways, it is well armored for its time frame. The armor would probably fall short in later time frames, and the 163 millimeters of penetration is actually quite effective at this in the early war period, if you will. The accuracy I found to be pretty decent, and even the gun arcing, if you will, the gun lane was actually pretty good in itself. So it's definitely a solid tank all in all. I really like it. I like the style of it. It kind of reminds me of a slightly oversized Matilda, but yeah, there it is. You know, basically an oversized Matilda turned into a tank destroyer, and it's actually quite effective. The next vehicle I have here is the Koning's Panzer 1 BV2, and this is from the Krum. This weighs in at 111.42 tons. It's armed with a 120mm main gun, and it's got 302 millimeters of penetration, and this is for the late war period. Now, this kind of reminds me of if you took like a Cane Tiger and supersized it, because that's essentially what he did here. Now, there are some elements I think I see from other tanks as well, such as the front of the turret looks more from like the Leopard 1, where it kind of comes to a point instead of being rounded. I see that the turret's longer, so it's definitely got a redesigned turret idea, which seems to work in my opinion, as it's got additional cargo compartments and stuff of that nature. I also like the periscope on top of the roof. I think that's actually a rather good idea. The position probably could be a little bit more off to the right or the left there than it is, just because of where the breech block would be in the tank, but that's, in my opinion, that's actually a rather cool idea. I don't know if this is supposed to really be an interwar tank or a late war tank. Maybe it's supposed to be more like an early Cold War heavy tank. But either ways, the other thing too is it's actually got some rather good mobility. Now, the armor for being a heavy tank does kind of fall short, as it's only got like the front glacis plate's only like 160 millimeters thick. Although it is sloped back, so it is more effective than having a flat plate. But that being said, it's also, like I said, it's got some really, really good mobility. So it's kind of like, you don't get that thick boy Mouse or E100 or Louvre type armor. Instead, you get a slightly thinner armor with a much more mobile heavy tank, with also, in my opinion, a really good gun. Also, like how he mounted a searchlight there above the gun too, which kind of gives me the idea that this might be more towards the Cold War than actually a late World War II vehicle. The next vehicle I have here is from Rexy, and this is the Thrasher. I rather like this one. I kind of feel like he might have taken some inspirations from like the OF-40. Wait, is it I believe it's OF-40. I could be wrong. It's an Italian main battle tank, or even the AMX-40. This weighs in at 28.52 tons. It's armed with a 105mm main gun with 238 millimeters of penetration. This is for the late war period. Now, with that being said, I actually found the mobility to be rather good. However, climbing uphill was a bit difficult. The armor, I honestly really didn't put to the full test. It didn't really seem all that good, that it seemed like this was more like a main battle tank, or even like a heavier medium tank. Kind of like, think of like the TAM, if you're familiar with the TAM medium tank. It's still a medium tank with some rather decent armor, but it's more focused towards mobility and being built in a lightweight package, because if I remember correctly, the TAM serves with Argentina, if I remember correctly. So I think that might have been the inspiration for this vehicle. The next vehicle I have here is from X321. This is the Troop Transport. This has no armament, actually. He did not bother mounting or modeling the gun. It weighs in at 14 tons, and all in all, in my opinion, it seems like he was definitely heavily inspired by something like the M113, as you can definitely see that here. I'm trying to think of, I think the other one's the Samaritan, like the British version of the M113, or maybe it's the, it might be the FV432. Can't quite remember. But this is for the late war period. Now, the thing I will definitely give this is, overall, I think the design is just great. He definitely took some time and put some detail, quite a bit of detail in this vehicle. Mobility-wise is just superb. This thing just gets up and goes, and it goes every freaking where. Now, armor-wise, obviously, I didn't put the armor to the test because it's a non-combat vehicle. Of course, with it being an APC, a troop transport, if you will, I definitely would not consider this being a well-armored vehicle. But in any case, when time comes, if we need some troop transports, I think this is going to be a very good option to see in your files for Sprocket. Now, the next one I have here is from Coulson, and this one's a little sussy. Well, I'm old and shit. You got it twice there. This is the M53 A1 transformer from Coulson. And as you can see there, it literally transformed. I have no idea how he did that, so nobody ask me, because I really have no idea. You'd have to ask Coulson. It weighs in at 109.18 tons. It's armed with a 127 millimeter main gun, and it's got 356 millimeters of penetration for the late war period. Now, I'm going to say this straight out. I am not wild about the overall design. I think the vehicle is absolutely ridiculous. And that's the reason why I'm showing it here. It's absolutely ridiculous that it actually transforms from being a tank to being a sussy baka on stilts. All right. The final vehicle I have here today for this episode of Community Steel is from German Train. This is the N4b Toronto, and it weighs in at 26.02 tons. It's armed with a 75 millimeter main gun with 102 millimeters of penetration, and this is for the mid-war period. And generally speaking, it's a Sherman. Now, I did have some mobility issues with this, and I even tried to tweak it, and I was still having mobility issues. Understand that he might have used the regular build of Sprocket, and I had this set for the experimental build, so it might have fucked with this build a little bit, which is what I think happened personally. Now, when it came to the gun wasn't super impressive, but it's also a 75 millimeter gun. He did the best job he could to really model this after the Sherman and give it his own slight little take, if you will. And honestly, it does, for the most part, look like a Sherman. And when not going uphill, it actually drives pretty good. It drives a lot like a Sherman as well. While the armor's nothing super incredible, the armor actually did take some abuse as well, including being shot at from 17-pounder guns from TOGs. Which the problem is with the TOGs is they were so damn far away I couldn't hit the damn things, but well, that's neither here nor there. That's me being old and shit more than anything else. But yeah, so I actually rather like this vehicle. I like the look of it. I am a bit of a sucker for a Sherman, so what can I say there? Yeah, see, there you go. I just bounced another one from a TOG. 17-pounder bouncing shots. How about that? When it comes to the armor and stuff like that, it was actually fairly close to being authentic too. So just proof that the Sherman's armor is actually quite effective, especially at longer ranges where the angles and the rounding actually works. Now, that being said, he's got multiple variants of this. I grabbed, honestly, my favorite variant where he actually took the time to make it look like it had the cast armor, but he's also got other variants too where it's got the welded armor. And honestly, all the variants of his Toronto tanks looks really good. This just so happened to be one of my favorite ones of the ones that he had posted. But anyway, folks, that will wrap up today's episode of Community Steel. Quite a long one, as I showed off 9 vehicles, but there you go, folks. Hopefully you all enjoyed it. Thank you very much for tuning in, and hopefully you have yourselves a wonderful day.